It's Friday night, and somewhere beyond your window, the world is moving with voices spilling out of bars, headlights sweeping through intersections, music thumping behind closed doors. You can almost feel the pull of it, that invisible current saying you should be out there too, participating in whatever collective ritual everyone else seems to have agreed to without you. But you're here in the soft lamplight of your own space, and there's something about this moment, this deliberate choice to remain, that the world doesn't quite know what to do with. Staying in carries a weight in our culture that gets translated, interpreted, diagnosed before you can even explain it. People assume you're lonely or sad or socially anxious, or that something went wrong somewhere along the way, some developmental detour that left you unable to enjoy what normal people enjoy. They look at you with a certain concerned sympathy, as if you're missing out on life itself, as if the real world only exists in the spaces between other people. What if that's not it at all, though? And what if staying in isn't a withdrawal from life, but a different kind of engagement with it? The quiet you're seeking isn't emptiness, but a specific kind of fullness that only arrives when the noise falls away. The psychology behind this preference goes deeper than introversion, deeper than social anxiety, deeper than any neat category we try to file it under. This isn't about being unable to handle the world out there, but about knowing, with a clarity that feels almost cellular, that something necessary happens when you close the door behind you and let yourself simply be. You've probably tried to explain this to people, how the idea of going out sometimes feels less like an invitation and more like a demand, how there's a difference between loneliness and aloneness, between isolation and solitude. You can be surrounded by people and feel utterly disconnected, and then be completely alone and feel profoundly at peace. The words never quite land right because the world speaks a language of visibility, of social proof of presence as participation, and what you're trying to describe exists in the opposite direction, in the invisible, the private, the interior. So you stop trying to explain and you simply stay, and in that staying something quiet and true begins to unfold. This isn't a story about people who can't go out, but about people who don't need to. People who've discovered that home isn't just a physical location, but a psychological state. A return to yourself after spending so much of your life performing for an audience you never auditioned for. Maybe that's what the world finds unsettling. Not that you're staying in, but that you've found something there. Something that doesn't require their validation or their presence. Something that belongs entirely to you. There's a quiet rebellion in preferring to stay home. Not the loud, defiant kind that announces itself, but the subtle, persistent kind that simply opts out, that declines the invitation without apology, that recognises the emperor has no clothes, and decides very calmly to just not participate in the charade. Somewhere along the way, you realise that life doesn't only happen in restaurants and concert venues and crowded rooms, but happens in the pause, between thoughts, in the way light falls through your window, at a certain time of day, in the book that breaks you open at 3 a.m, in the conversation you have with yourself when no one else is listening. Once you've tasted that, once you've felt what it's like to exist, without the constant low-grade anxiety of being perceived, going back becomes very difficult. This isn't about fear, but about knowing that your energy is finite, that your attention is precious, that you only get so many evenings in this life, and some of them you want to spend in the quiet company of yourself, without explanation, without defense, without having to be anything other than exactly what you are in that moment. The world will keep moving out there with its lights glowing and invitations coming, and you'll keep choosing this gentle, deliberate return to the only place where you don't have to translate yourself into something more palatable, more social, more acceptable. You'll keep choosing home, not because you're broken, but because you understand something about your own nature, something the noise makes it easy to forget. Sometimes the deepest form of living happens in the quietest rooms. There's a moment that happens when you step through your front door after being out in the world, and you probably don't even notice it anymore because it's so automatic, so practiced. But your body knows and your nervous system registers it like a signal that you're safe now, that you have permission to lower the guard. Your shoulders drop half an inch while your breathing deepens, and the muscles in your face, which have been holding some subtle expression all day, finally relax into their natural state. You become, in that threshold crossing, slightly more real. This isn't metaphorical, but your physiology responding to the removal of a constant invisible pressure. The pressure of being watched, evaluated, interpreted by others, the pressure of managing how you're coming across. Out there in the social world, you exist partially as yourself and partially as your own performance. And even with people you love, even in places you enjoy, there's a small part of your awareness that stays on duty, monitoring, adjusting, code switching between versions of yourself. Here in your own space, that monitoring system can finally power down. People don't understand this when they wonder why you prefer staying in, because they think of home as neutral, as default, as the absence of experience, but for you, home is presence, the only place where all of your attention can face inward instead of outward, where you're not dividing your consciousness between who you are and who you appear to be. The control you have over your environment here isn't about rigidity, but about sovereignty, where you decide the temperature, the lighting, the sounds. You decide when to engage and when to retreat. You decide whether to be stimulated or still, productive or at rest. This kind of sensory autonomy might seem trivial to people who move through the world without constantly bumping against its edges, but for you it's oxygen. The world is loud in ways that go beyond volume because it's energetically loud, and all those voices and faces and expectations and unspoken social rules create a kind of static that you have to filter through just to think clearly. Filtering requires energy that you'd rather spend on other things, on thoughts that matter, on feelings that need space to breathe. There's a theory in psychology about attachment, about how our earliest experiences with safety and connection shape the way we relate to closeness and distance for the rest of our lives. Some people learned that love meant enmeshment, that connection required the dissolution of boundaries, while others learned that closeness came with conditions, with performances, with the suppression of certain true things. If that's your story, if you learned early that being yourself and being loved were sometimes incompatible, then solitude might not feel like loneliness at all, but might feel like the first honest relationship you ever had. Not solitude as punishment, but solitude as reunion with the parts of yourself you had to hide to survive out there. This is why staying in doesn't feel like deprivation, but feels like restoration. Like coming back to a version of yourself that the world keeps asking you to abandon. The version that thinks slowly, feels deeply, needs silence to process complexity. The version that can't perform enthusiasm for things that don't genuinely move you, that can't pretend small talk is connection, that can't sustain the bright light energy the world seems to prefer. Your nervous system knows what it needs, and sometimes what it needs is the radical act of not having to be anything for anyone. There's a difference between chosen solitude and fearful isolation, between retreating to restore and hiding to avoid. And the distinction matters because you probably know it instinctively. Chosen solitude feels like relief, like expansion, like coming home to yourself, while isolation feels like contraction, like cutting off, like slowly disappearing. If what you're doing is the former, if staying in makes you more yourself and not less, then it's not something that needs to be fixed, but something that needs to be honoured. Your home, your space, your solitude isn't a bunker, but a sanctuary. And there's a difference between those two things, because a bunker is where you hide from what terrifies you, while a sanctuary is where you go to remember what's sacred. What's sacred turns out to be the uninterrupted experience of your own interior life, the thoughts that arrive only when you stop talking, the feelings that surface only when you stop performing, the ideas that emerge only when you stop consuming, the self that exists only when you're not busy being everyone else's version of you. This is the architecture of inner safety, not walls that keep the world out, but boundaries that keep you in your own experience, in your own rhythm, in your own truth. Once you've built this, once you've created a life where you're not constantly leaking energy into spaces that don't replenish you, tolerating environments that demand you dismantle it becomes very difficult. So you stay, not because you're afraid of the world, but because you're committed to yourself. Not because you can't connect, but because you've learned that the deepest connection you'll ever have is the one you maintain with the quiet, constant presence of your own being. The world might call this isolation, but you know better because you know it's integration. Somewhere, somehow, we all received the same memo telling us to show up, be seen, participate, prove you're living by being visible, as if existence itself requires witnesses, as if a life lived quietly, privately, authentically doesn't count unless it's been verified by the presence of others. You can feel this expectation like a weight in the air whenever someone asks what you did over the weekend, and you have to decide whether to tell the truth, that you stayed in, read, thought, rested, existed, or offer up something more acceptable, something that signals you're still playing the game. There's a game, an unspoken agreement that to be a functioning member of society means to be socially available, energetically generous, perpetually open to connection, and people who opt out get labelled as antisocial, reclusive, depressed. As if the only reason someone would choose solitude is because something is wrong with them, not because something might be wrong with the relentless demand for constant social performance. You didn't sign up for this contract where no one asked you if you agreed to measure your worth by your social calendar, to prove your mental health by your willingness to attend events you don't want to attend, to demonstrate your love for others by sacrificing your own need for quiet. The contract exists anyway, enforced not by rules but by the subtle disapproval in people's voices when you decline an invitation, by the concerned questions from family members who worry you're isolating, by the cultural narrative that frames staying home as something to overcome, a phase to grow out of, a problem to solve. Maybe the most exhausting part isn't even the social events themselves, but the constant low-grade guilt that comes with prioritizing your own needs over other people's expectations, the internal negotiation every time an invitation arrives, the calculation of how much will this cost me, how long will I need to recover, is this obligation worth the depletion? People don't see this when they judge your preference for staying in, because they don't see the effort it takes to be on, in social situations, the energy you spend reading the room, matching the tone, finding the right words, being the right amount of present without being too much or too little. They don't understand that for you socializing isn't rejuvenating, but a performance that requires rehearsal, execution, and a recovery period afterwards. You're good at it, probably, having learned how to do it well enough that most people don't even realize it's costing you anything, where you can laugh at the right moments, ask the right questions, seem engaged and interested and normal. Beneath that competent surface, there's a part of you that's counting the minutes, rationing your energy, waiting for the moment you can leave without seeming rude. This is authenticity fatigue, the exhaustion that comes from being slightly other than yourself for extended periods, from code switching between the version of you that exists in private and the version that's acceptable in public, from holding in the thoughts that are too complex, too dark, too real for casual conversation. The strange thing is, the more you do it, the more you lose touch with which version is real. Because after enough time spent performing, you start to forget what you actually think, what you actually feel, what you actually want, and the performance becomes so practiced that it starts to eclipse the person underneath. This is why staying in isn't avoidance but reclamation, choosing to spend time with the unedited version of yourself before you forget that version exists. The digital age has made this all more complicated because now you can stay physically home but still be socially available, still performing, still managing your image and responding and presenting. And the boundary between public and private has become porous in ways that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. You can see everyone else's Friday night in real time, every dinner, every gathering, every moment of connection you're not part of. And there's a particular kind of ache that comes with scrolling through evidence of all the life happening without you, even when, especially when, you chose not to be part of it. This is where FOMO lives, in the gap between what you're doing and what you imagine you should be doing. The fear that everyone else has figured out how to enjoy the things you find draining, that they're accessing some level of life you're missing, that your preference for quiet is costing you something necessary. What if it's not, though? And what if the joy you're supposedly missing out on isn't actually joy at all, but just noise dressed up as connection, stimulation, masquerading as meaning. The JOMO, the joy of missing out, might be more real than you've been allowed to believe. There's a different kind of courage required to disappoint people, to let them down gently but firmly, to stop performing availability you don't feel, to risk being misunderstood in service of being authentic. Every time you say no to something that doesn't serve you, you're saying yes to yourself, to your energy, to your truth, to your right to exist on your own terms, rather than everyone else's expectations. This doesn't mean you never go out, never connect, never participate, but means you choose consciously. Instead of complying automatically, you distinguish between obligations that nourish you and obligations that merely deplete you. You stop letting guilt be the primary motivator of your social life. The people who matter will understand, and the people who don't understand don't need to, and the people who judge you for prioritizing your own well-being over their expectations of you, well, those aren't your people anyway. The social contract we didn't sign is powerful, but it's not binding, and you are allowed to renegotiate the terms, to write your own clauses, to opt out of the parts that never made sense for your particular nervous system, your particular soul. You're allowed to stay home, not because the world is too much, but because you are enough. Something happens in the sustained quiet of your own company, something you can't access in the noise, in the constant outward orientation of social life. A kind of deepening, a settling into layers of yourself that only emerge when everything else falls away. This is what staying in offers that nothing else can, not escape from the world, but arrival at yourself. Intimacy isn't just about closeness with others, but about closeness with your own interior landscape, with the thoughts you think when no one's listening, with the feelings you feel when you don't have to explain them, with the person you become when you're released from the obligation to be anyone in particular. This kind of self-intimacy requires time, unstructured, unwitnessed time where nothing is expected of you and everything is permitted. Time to wander through your own mind without a destination. Time to feel your feelings all the way through instead of performing recovery. Time to discover what you actually want instead of what you've been taught to want. This is where creativity lives and where insight emerges, where the scattered pieces of your experience finally have space to arrange themselves into patterns that make sense. You can't think deeply while you're managing how you're coming across. You can't feel fully while you're monitoring whether your feelings are appropriate. You can't discover who you are while you're busy being who everyone else needs you to be. So you stay in, and in the staying you start to notice things like the particular quality of afternoon light in your space, the rhythm of your own thoughts when they're not interrupted, the way your body feels when it's allowed to move or not move according to its own wisdom rather than social obligation. You start to hear yourself again, not the voice that speaks in conversations, but the deeper voice that only speaks in silence, the one that knows things your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet, the one that's been trying to tell you something if you'd only stop moving long enough to listen. This is the gift of solitude, not loneliness, but the relief of your own company. The discovery that you're actually quite interesting when you're not diluting yourself for mass consumption. That your thoughts have texture and depth and strangeness that gets lost when you try to make them palatable for others. There's a balance here, and you know it. A line between nourishing retreat and harmful withdrawal. Between choosing solitude because it restores you and choosing it because you're afraid of what connection might ask of you. The difference is in how it feels, where healthy solitude feels like expansion, like you're growing into yourself, becoming more and not less, while unhealthy isolation feels like contraction, like you're shrinking, avoiding, slowly disappearing from your own life. If staying in makes you more capable of connection when you do choose it, more present, more yourself, then it's working. But if it's making you less able to function, less willing to engage, more frightened of the world, then something else is happening. Something that might need attention, support, intervention. You probably know which one you're experiencing because your body knows and your heart knows. And the question is whether you're willing to be honest about it. The goal isn't to stay in forever, but to stay in long enough to remember who you are, to restore the energy that gets depleted by constant performance, to maintain connection with the parts of yourself that the world asks you to abandon. Your home isn't a hiding place, but a launch pad, the place you return to, gather yourself before you venture out again. The place where you remember what matters, what's true, what you're actually trying to do with this brief and strange life. From that place of groundedness, of self-knowledge, of restoration, you can engage with the world more authentically. Not because you have to, but because you choose to. Not from depletion, but from overflow. This is the paradox where the more time you spend with yourself, the more you have to offer others. The more you honor your need for quiet, the more meaningful your presence becomes when you do show up. The more you stay in, the more prepared you are to go out. Not as a performance, but as yourself. Maybe the most radical thing you can do, in a world that demands constant availability, constant performance, constant social proof, is simply this: to know yourself well enough to choose when to engage and when to retreat, when to show up and when to stay home, when to explain yourself and when to let the mystery of your preference speak for itself. Your life is yours, not theirs, not society's, not some imagined audience that's judging your choices from the outside. Yours. If what you choose is the quiet, the solitude, the gentle unfolding that happens in your own space, in your own time, in your own way, then that's not something to apologize for, but something to honor. The world will keep turning, and the invitations will keep coming, and you'll keep choosing yourself again and again in the small sacred act of staying in. Not because you're broken, but because you understand something necessary. Home is not where you hide from life, but where you finally, fully arrive at it.